why don't we get started? The plan for today was to give all of the students an opportunity to ask questions of the faculty who could be here, which is almost all of us. And the questions we would encourage you, not to, to think broadly, things that you want to know about, things about one's path through science, things about how you find your way to problems. I would say the hope is that you'll feel comfortable asking a very broad set of questions. I think we will continue to do this through the chat, although we might call on you for clarification. Hopefully over the course of the hour or so, you'll hear from all of us. Let me say at the beginning that when I've done this before, I've found it to be incredibly interesting. Students ask questions that are often unexpected and make us really think about what we're doing. So I look forward to that. And let me invite someone to be brave and type the first question in the chat, and we'll get started and see how things flow. One more thing. As we mentioned, the first half we're going to record and post on the website, and the second half we won't record. So if you have a question that you really would like to ask but would prefer that you're having asked that question is not kept for posterity, ask it after the break. But otherwise, let's just get started. So, so there's a question. Any tips for navigating the job market? For example, looking for postdocs in the COVID era. Does someone want to try that? I mean, I can give it a shot. I think everything in this time, the first thing is to ease up on yourself a little bit and realize that these are not normal times, and you can't expect of yourself that everything, if things are not proceeding as you hoped, probably not your fault. I realize that doesn't solve the problem of getting a job, but it does. But it is important to remember. I think that certainly there are places that are going to be running searches. I mean, now that we know that we have sort of a whole year of this coming up, right? There are places that are going to be running searches, and they're going to run them online, and it will work however well it works. But at least they sort of know in advance that that's what they're supposed to be doing. I think last year was very problematic, in part because the things happen sort of in the middle of processes, and so for example, for faculty positions, some people had already had their interview visit, and some people had not, and in between it became impossible to travel. So how do you make choices between people when one person you got to spend time with in person and the other person you only got to see over Zoom? Maybe you shouldn't make that choice. So it was chaos. It will be difficult in the sense that there are financial implications of the pandemic that are only just beginning to be felt at universities, but it should be a little less chaotic. I don't know if that's
Perhaps then I'll answer the second. Oh, Bill, for you?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the chaos brings us to the second question, which was, why is everyone working on SYK? And the answer is, it's chaotic and solvable. So it was the first, and still really the only model that's exhibits many-body quantum chaos and that one can solve.
Thank you.
I'm curious. So the person who asked about navigating the job market, I think, Bill, did you interpret that question as how do we get the job market? Oh, in the COVID era. Okay, never mind. Yes, it wasn't a general question. It was specifically now. Okay.
Yeah, all the usual questions are still there, but there's the extra one for our time. There's this wonderful one. What was the next option you were most considering next to the one you actually took? How did you ultimately make the decision? So I'm curious, maybe Devin, you'd like to amplify the question a little bit for us. Do you mean large scale decisions like, you know, I was thinking about stand-up comedy, but I just wasn't funny enough, so I became a physicist? Or do you mean, you know, I had 2 postdoc offers and I had to decide which one to take? The bigger picture one. So do people want to talk about becoming a scientist versus not becoming a scientist?
Well, I guess, I mean, I guess I'm the youngest here academically speaking. I mean, I'm the one postdoc who like just faced this last year. So like, maybe I can chime in a little bit on this. My philosophy was I didn't want to settle for anything. And in that process, also keeping my mind very open about what the possibilities were. So I was very excited about, so when I was going on the job market, I had no idea exactly what I wanted to do. And I was sort of following whatever seemed the most exciting to me at the moment, with the idea that I wasn't going to settle for a job that didn't seem exciting. So there's been some twists and turns. I was supposed to be like a medical doctor and then decided to go into physics instead. And so that was an interesting little twist. And that sort of keeps happening. So, yeah. I don't know what else to add to that.
I mean, I suppose I can give some bits of self-realization that I've come by over the years. I mean, it seems like most of us are not systematic. I mean, there are some of us who are pretty systematic about evaluating, well, why am I doing this? But even those people tend to, and by those people I mean myself, even when you make a conscious effort to be deliberate, you may not be seeing the bigger picture. I think that's just generally the case. For example, at some point in graduate school, I was unhappy, stuck, changing advisors for the second time, things like that. And I started regressing myself to asking, how did I end up being in physics? And I kept regressing until I got to middle school. So both of my parents are chemists, and I was immersed in kind of like learning about elements and stuff, and I like mathematics. And I realized, just thinking back, is that the reason I ended up being a physicist, and this is silly, but it's true, right? I was into science fiction when I was in middle school, and I wanted to travel to distant stars. And so when I started high school, I wanted to ask myself, okay, high school is only 3 or 4 years. I need to plan for the future. Space travel is going to be my thing. And so I realized that spaceships were just not powerful enough. And if you want to travel to distant stars, you have to build your own spaceship. You have to learn, gravity, quantum gravity, what have you. And so I think the direction of studying physics was set by me wanting to travel distant stars. And I did not reassess that until middle of graduate school. And because I did start graduate school in high energy theory, and I think switching to condensed matter made you kind of like put your feet on the ground type thing. So this is an example where it's just true. That's how it happened, and I think things like that just happen all the time. The other thing I should say is that once you sort of grow up and start looking for jobs, and you start balancing things, as a physicist, at least I found that the education is pretty versatile, and there are all kinds of non-physics occupations. I considered working for a patent office, things like that, especially when you're a postdoc and you're trying to find a job where you want to live and you can't find a job where you want to live. And you know, I think open-mindedness is a good thing. And in the end, it's a lot of these things are left to chance. You know, if you do the best you can with what you got, and you know, anyway. I started at CUNY just over 10 years. At that point, I got almost uniformly negative advice about coming to CUNY. CUNY was kind of in a transition. I think now CUNY is far better established scientifically. There are several active and prominent people who are at CUNY. So I think the people who are being hired to CUNY now are far less concerned about, oh, this is going to be a dead end for my career. Whereas I got very clear advice from most people that I respected that do not go to CUNY. and if that happens, you're going to go and you have an open mind. Maybe in 2 years I'll switch fields. But anyway.
Yeah, I think it's also good to remember. I don't know the statistics in other countries, but certainly in the U.S., most reasonably well, people who have fairly high level of education actually change jobs quite frequently, of order 5 years. And so, and the truth is that the beginnings of your scientific career are in these kinds of chunks, right? You spend 5 years in graduate school, you spend some number of years as a postdoc, maybe you do a second postdoc, you spend some number of years as an assistant professor. And so maybe you should always be thinking about what's the most exciting thing you could be doing with the next few years of your life, not where is this leading? Because while you're trying to figure out where this is leading, the world is changing. And that's a very hard calculation. But the question of, of the options that are available to you at the moment, what's the most exciting way to spend the next few years? That's something you can try and reach a conclusion about. I mean, you could of course be wrong, but at least you can go into it saying, this was the most exciting thing I could be doing, and so I'm doing it. And is this a career? I don't know. I mean, but you'll find out later. The questions are coming more rapidly, so let me back up a little bit.
There's some request for follow-up from Catherine, I think.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm seeing a couple that I think I can merge together. So there's one which is, how can we encourage more women in physics, particularly from developing countries? And then also, what are the challenges that I faced as a woman in physics and how do I overcome them? And then I can also sort of lump in together the one that was, how did I go from thinking I was going to be a medical doctor to a physics PhD? So there's a lot of really big topics all coming together. But for the first one, how do we encourage women in physics, particularly from developing countries? Like, that is a huge question, and it blends together several different aspects. So there's the sort of gender issues in physics, because it is a very male-dominated field, and then also it can, like aspects of academia, physics can sometimes be a little elitist in the sense that you kind of need money to sort of propel yourself through graduate school, and coming in internationally can be quite difficult. How do we address these problems? There's something that I'm still trying to figure out. What is the best option? For me personally, going through this, I've had to just accept that I'm going to be different. That's just going to be an aspect of who I am, and not trying to fight that anymore, to just sort of embrace that, and then to try and find people who are supportive. Like, building a supporting network is the thing that will get you through it. Like, if I did not have a supportive advisor, if I didn't have really good friends in grad school, like I really wouldn't have been able to get here.
There's a question about working at a predominantly teaching-based academic career versus research being at the center. So, I don't know. I mean, there are institutions where teaching is is much more. So first of all, at all universities, the fact of the matter is that what you're being paid to do is to teach. Now, whether the way you're evaluated corresponds to that or not is a different question. I think there are lots of places where teaching is I mean, the degree to which teaching is central to the college or university's view of its faculty varies enormously. Certainly in the US, you have places, you have the small liberal arts colleges, which prize teaching very highly. I know people who have actually moved from major research universities to small liberal arts colleges and found that to be very satisfying. In fact, doing research and engaging the undergraduates that they work with is and can be wonderful. So I think you can find your way. I also think it's important to remember that since different institutions are different along this axis, it's not true that you can take all of the institutions that you might be applying to for jobs and put them in order and just look for the one that comes out highest on the list that also happens to offer you a job, right? There are different dimensions to your life, not only teaching versus research, but what kind of community you'll be living in, whether this works for the other people in your life. It is a very multidimensional thing, and so the ranking of an institution as a research place is not the only thing we should be thinking about.
I think there's also a historical trend which may continue or not to that's strengthened institutions that used to not be research oriented to become research oriented. I've gotten the sense from talking to old timers who remembered, so back in the day, they could count on one hand the number of institutions that had first-rate research, and then you fast forward 10 years or 20 years, all of a sudden all kinds of middle-range institutions have pockets of excellence. Some of this is global shifts. A bunch of ex-Soviet sort of scientists show up. They can't all get jobs at MIT and Harvard, and they end up getting jobs at lower institutions, because the point is that the standards for promotion and mentorship, if you like, are departmental. So if there is a critical mass of like-minded scientists that end up in one institution, they can change the culture. And by critical mass, usually it takes 2 or 3, right? So it's not, so you can kind of see, and of course, for this to succeed, the federal government has to be fair giving out grants. So if there's good science done at a no-name institution, you give it to people, you don't give it to an institution. And I think historically, if you looked at just this, my feeling is that if you look at the number of places where the institution migrated from being teaching only to teaching plus research, that number probably went up. But I'm not sure if that's anecdotal evidence or just, so, I don't know.
Perhaps I can partially answer 2 questions. So there was one question on for people who have few opportunities for research as an undergrad, what are some things they can spend their time doing? And the other question was, how do you know if you're ready for graduate school? Perhaps an answer I could give is that it seems useful to have some questions that you would like to know the answer to. So I think many people were motivated to go into physics or some particular area of physics based on very little knowledge, like when they were in middle school or high school, sort of like Vadim said. But then now you can ask more based on not very precise questions, but now you can, even as an undergrad, ask something of a, not a really precise research question, but some question, some problem you would like to know the answer to. And then thinking about how you might, just trying to find the answer yourself is a good way to direct what you learn, because you can't learn everything. And so if you start learning things in this concentrated way, sort of keeping an eye on the problem you actually want to know the answer to, then it makes things coherent.
Yeah, I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot to be said for, trying to formulate your own questions. So get excited. It's also true that I think a question that you want to know the answer to provides you with the kind of drive that it takes to learn the things along the way. And don't be afraid to be naive about some of these questions. I mean, you know that you're going to be naive because you don't know that much, but that's okay. Naive questions often have profound answers.
I think perhaps to add to that, what I found is somewhat frustrating aspect is that most of the questions one eventually figures out are not going to be answered anytime soon. And so one then has to move on and ask easier questions. Like when I was an undergrad, there was a popular question, which was how to explain the value of the cosmological constant. And this had been there were attempts at explaining this over decades. And then, there had been a theoretical bias that the cosmological constant is zero, but no theoretical explanation for why it should be zero, no good explanation. Then it was measured to be non-zero, and then, but very small. And then this became like one of the central questions in high energy theory of explaining the cosmological constant. And I think there's an answer which is probably the most likely answer, which most people don't find satisfactory, and there's no good alternative. And so that I concluded at the beginning of grad school is not a good problem to be working on. And so that's just the way it is.
You draw everyone's attention to what Damien Cho wrote in the chat about actual life at liberal arts college. Emphasizing that there are paths to doing exciting research, but that will not be your full-time job in the way that it might be at a university that emphasizes research. There's a question from Vadim about having streamlined interest when applying to graduate school, and if you've explored different subfields over the course of the undergraduate career, is that a disadvantage? So I'm going to give you my impressions from having sat on the PhD admissions committee recently, and I don't know how widely shared those views are, but I would say that the most important thing is to be able to write coherently about what you've done in your words, and to have a sensible view of how what you've done relates to what you want to do. So I've read an amazing number of applications from people who, in the summer after their first year of university, they worked in a lab doing X, and they write a perfectly sensible paragraph about X. And in the summer after their second year at university, they worked in a lab doing Y, and they write a perfectly sensible paragraph about Y. And what they would like to do in graduate school is Z. And there's absolutely no indication that they know anything about Z. Now, it might be that they have a vision of what Z is, and there's a reason they want to do it, and so on, but you kind of get the sense that they think that having done X and Y prepares them to do Z, and that just might not be true if X, Y, and Z are all sufficiently different from each other. And so it's not that having shifted interest counts against you. It's that not being able to articulate what's going on with your shift in interests and how you're preparing yourself to do something very different than what you've been doing before, that counts against you. So I think that people who stuck with one thing, of course, they will appear to have been more productive because they spent more time doing one thing. And that, if somebody's counting rather than reading, that will lift them up a little bit. But that's not a reason to stick with something that you're not interested in. right? That's a very bad, don't, for goodness sake, if you've spent one summer doing something, don't think that you should stick with it because you want to be a good candidate for graduate school, right? I mean, you shouldn't commit to 5 years of working on something because you think that's the only thing you can make a plausible case for. So I also think that research experience, not only, I mean, not just as an undergraduate preparing for graduate school, but more generally, it's about learning what it means to work on a problem where genuinely people don't know the answer. And to get back to what Vladimir was saying, we don't even know whether the question was very well posed to begin with, right? When you're in the classroom, you're given problems to work on that have answers, and we know they have answers. Doing research is about formulating questions that don't necessarily have answers, and you have to tune the question for, find the balance in defining the question so that you can answer them. And having that experience is very important. The particular thing that you did should be less important, but you need to be clear about how the particular thing, about what you learned from the experience and how that prepares you for what you want to do next. Somebody want to take one of the, so I hope that helps with that one. Someone's asked how you go about choosing problems to work on. Does somebody want to, problem choice is a great question. Somebody should try that.
I get the sense that there are sort of two categories of papers for this, of how do you choose problems. So or at least in high energy, a route that many people take is, which is sort of useful for generating papers is, and perhaps for doing research, is somebody does something and then you generalize what they did or do a slightly different case. And this is a good thing to do if, well, in some cases, this is a good thing to do because there's a good reason to do the other case, some more general case or something that paper didn't do. It's also done because then you learn what they did. Then there's the other category of papers where, usually by better physicists, where they truly want to answer some question, and then they answer it, or in answering it, they discover a better question, and then they write the paper as if that was the question they wanted to answer. And those are sort of the more original and more important papers, but ones that are much rarer and much harder to write. But I guess one thing that is that even in those cases, the questions that people wanted to answer are a small variation of something else that they heard or thought about. It's never a very broad question. One has to be very concrete. So like, for instance, in the case of the SYK model, my understanding is that Kitaev was studying the papers of Schenker and Stanford, where they asked a very particular question about entanglement entropy in black holes in ADS. And so that was his motivation. So it was just understanding their work in this very concrete setting. The starting point wasn't some general question of how to understand how information gets out of black holes, which is an intractably hard question. It was just a specific question.
Maybe I can basically say the same thing using slightly different terminology. I think, at least in condensed matter physics, there is the dark age of trying to do band structures and understand what actual materials are doing, and that's sort of your bread and butter. And then there was and that's when it was called solid state physics. And I think Phil Anderson is credited the late great Phil Anderson, is credited for focusing on phenomena and simple, compelling models that contain those phenomena. And so somehow thinking about collective phenomena as sort of just a piece of physics that stands on its own, and then thinking about in what kind of systems that would be realized is sort of it's a fairly modern, comparatively modern approach. And I think when you choose problems, you can either think of what kind of phenomena that haven't been thought of. I think that's pretty fascinating. I mean, if you manage to do that, it's wonderful. It's also extremely respectable to take a phenomenon that people have talked about and find an example of it where you can work out a lot of details, and that's sort of the example of SYK, where because inadvertently when you work things out in detail, you have a pencil and paper outline of what the thing looks like, and now you provide shading, you provide color, you realize that it's actually more interesting or not, or maybe less interesting sometimes, right? And so so model building and model design is a fun activity in its own right, because if you know what phenomenon you're looking for, you can reverse engineer the simplest and the most boring model that has that phenomenon and has nothing else. It's like what you see is what you get. And the idea is that usually when you build models, you kind of like try to bridge the distance to the real world. Anyhow, it's an art. It's not it's only part of science.
On this topic, I agree with sort of one of the approaches that Vladimir was saying, that reading papers in the field that address a question that seems interesting to you is pretty useful, because sometimes you read a paper and you think, gosh, I wish I had written that paper, and okay, maybe you should go work on something else. But more often than not, you read it and you think, oh, I would have asked the question somewhat differently, or I would have solved it somewhat differently, and then you might have a research project on your hand.
And I think just to highlight some comparison among the things you've heard, right? As a theorist, there's two very different kinds of motivation, right? There's things which are internal to the world of theory, and there are things which are very specifically connected to phenomena in the real world. Right? So it might be that you see something that our experimentalist friends have discovered or characterized, and there's something about it that really strikes you as odd or compelling in some way that maybe other people haven't appreciated, or maybe it's just seems like a puzzle and you'd like to understand how that's possible. And then the other thing is, well, we have a certain theoretical structure for describing the world, and within that structure there are natural questions. And I mean, this isn't a terribly clean separation, because as a theorist, when you look at data and phenomena, part of why you find some things more compelling or surprising than others is obviously grounded in your theoretical understanding. But both of these are sources of inspiration, and they're very different. They're very different kinds of sources, and they also require, to take advantage of them, require different activities on your part, right? You'll be reading very different kinds of papers, and there's no, I mean, at a certain moment in any particular field, there might be more emphasis on one thing than the other, right? The enormous success of the standard model in electric particle physics means that the number of phenomenological puzzles that are driving people's research is very small. And there are more things that are sort of internal to the theoretical structures. Whereas in fields like condensed matter physics and biophysics, there's a lot more phenomenology that sort of sits out there unexplained. Does somebody else want to do did you stick with the same field that you did in graduate school question?
I feel like I keep changing fields every 2 years, but I think from an external, everyone else's viewpoint, I've been doing the exact same thing since I was an undergrad.
So that's, I think that's actually a really important point, that for example, I mean, if you zoom out, right, not to what individual scientists do, but even what whole communities do, the name of the physics department hasn't changed in 100 years, right? But what actually happens inside the physics department has undergone many revolutions. Whereas in other parts of the university, comparably large, even smaller changes in what people are actually doing have required the establishment and disestablishment of different departments. So, yeah, even what it means to say that you're doing the same thing versus a different thing, a little complicated. But Vladimir, maybe you should expand.
Maybe I should expand. Well, I don't know. There's nothing to. I guess an example which doesn't relate to me is that there's an annual conference called Strings, which has been happening for decades, and it repeatedly gets pointed out that most of the talks are not about string theory. They're just about quantum field theory or black holes or something else, but the conference continues to be called Strings. And this continues to be humorous because most string theorists aren't actually doing string theory in the sense of what you would, they're not really doing string theory, but for lack of a better word, the conference continues to be called Strings.
So, sorry, I knew that, and I just only now realized the paradox. If you're not doing string theory, why are you called a string theorist?
Because everyone else calls people who collaborate with older people who at one point did string theory string theorists.
I see, it's the, you're tainted. I see.
But also, it's the book I use most is the quantum field theory one and Polchinski's string theory one. So somehow it's like for instance, lots of people started doing conformal field theory, which is not string theory, but the conformal field theory, one of the main reasons it was studied extensively in 2 dimensions was because of string theory, because a string is, the string world sheet is the string is 1 + 1 dimensional, which is a 2-dimensional conformal field theory. And so one of the most useful, so if you learn about 2-dimensional conformal field theories, you end up learning it from things that were written in the string theory context with string theory examples.
Yeah, I guess I can reflect on this question also. I think it's generally difficult to switch fields, at least for most people. And I think the right way to switch fields is to keep your fingers in the old field so your productivity doesn't tank. I mean, my own case, I grew up doing, you know, equilibrium condensed matter physics. And I felt, as I was exiting graduate school, I felt that the field was somewhat crowded, and there were people doing progressively more complicated things that I just didn't have the taste for. I wanted to find new problems that, where the sharp questions were not sharply posed. So that somehow, there were more and more experiments with, many-body dynamics, and I wanted to do this. I knew people who basically jumped off the deep end, some people my age. And so through a few conferences, just rooming with these people and whatever, it helped shape my worldview. And over the next period of, whilst the postdoc, I made the transition to start working more and more on these problems. But unlike these other friends of mine who sort of just stopped working on equilibrium physics, I continued slowly. And, I think that's not the most efficient way to go, I think, but that's probably the more cautious approach. It's still within condensed matter physics. I think it's not as dramatic, but I also know people who went from doing string theory to biophysics rather efficiently. So it's not unheard of. I think physics education is pretty versatile.
I should say that if you're a theorist and you take your inspiration from phenomena, then when you start talking to a different group of experimentalists who are studying different phenomena, to some extent you've changed fields, even though maybe the kinds of questions you have in your mind that you're bringing to those different phenomena are similar. So yes, somebody just asked about the connection to experiment. I think we all know that the reason theoretical physics is a respectable activity is because occasionally we get things right in experiments. Not only in turn, right? The reason that in fact, the reason that you're permitted to engage in theoretical flights of fancy is because, you know, at various times those have turned out to be incredibly incisive about the real world. It's kind of a magical thing. So it is 11:50, and we do have the habit of taking a 10-minute break. There's a question about the most exciting developments in our fields. I think we each spoke for 4 hours, so maybe if we didn't give some sense of what we thought was exciting, then we failed on a larger scale. I understand the spirit of the question, but maybe today is not so much for concrete scientific questions. There's an issue there's some more issues about problem choice, which I think we could get back to after the break. But let's take a 10-minute break. I guess it's 11:54, so let's come back at 12:05. And at that point, the recording will cease. So if people have questions that are a little more, that they would prefer not to have recorded, that's a special invitation to ask those questions. Although the discussion can continue wherever you guys take it. So we'll pause for 10 minutes, and we'll see you at 12:05 East Coast time.